Welcome back to Therapeutics. In this block, we're going to talk about vaccines. Our objectives here are to review a bit about the principles of immunity, to differentiate passive from active immunity, and also talk about what vaccination is about, how it affects both individuals and society at large, to look at the roles of vaccines, and just a bit about immunoglobulins and where they fit, which will get reinforced throughout the year. Talk about some of the risks and benefits of vaccines, and spend some time talking about how we try to, in a sense, share with patients, educate patients, and listen to patients about their concerns about vaccines, and in a way really encourage them to evaluate the risk and benefit of vaccination for them. When we think about immunization, the purpose of immunization is to protect individuals from an infectious disease. And most of our vaccines or immunization processes are targeted against viruses. Sometimes we use other products as well that will target against other concerning pathogens for us or toxins of those pathogens. But the majority of our immunization efforts revolve around vaccines against viruses. I'd encourage you to spend some time sort of investigating on your own a bit about vaccines. The Food and Drug Administration has a nice webpage that talks about vaccine development. If vaccines are something that you feel like you need a little more than what we're going to provide here, I'd encourage you to look at either the CDC's websites or the FDA's websites about vaccines and how they're developed and how they're studied for their safety and efficacy. Recently, with all of the controversy and misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccine, the CDC has stepped up and really tried to make transparent the risks and benefits of vaccine and how vaccines are developed, approved, and monitored for safety and efficacy. And this graphic pretty much outlines these processes, which are not that much different from typical FDA processes for drug development. The vaccines go through a number of steps in both basic research and then clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3 involving humans, ultimately sent to the FDA for review and with a specific review from an advisory committee who has a lot of expertise in immunization and safety. And even after the vaccine is approved on the market or for emergency use, there are a lot of monitoring systems in place that assure both safety and efficacy of vaccines. And certainly I think we've gotten a front row seat in the last year listening to in the news about all of this safety and efficacy data that gets presented in the general public because of the impact of COVID-19. When we think about vaccines, there's vaccines or the process of immunization go back thousands of years, really. But in the, I'll call it the modern era, maybe it's not so modern, the late 1700s, the concern for smallpox in Europe prompted Edward Jenner to look at an approach to managing smallpox by injecting or exposing individuals who were not stricken yet with smallpox with something called cowpox, which was similar to smallpox, and using that to establish or evaluate whether or not that offered protection against smallpox. It would be considered highly unethical to do anything like this in this day and age, but over a couple of centuries, smallpox was considered, for the most part, eradicated by 1980. Let's go through a few definitions here, and then we'll spend a little more time in specificity. Definitions, first of all, of vaccine. Vaccine contains a whole or fractionated portion of the microorganism, or really in this point in time, we consider With the mRNA vaccines, not even that, but a process to stimulate the person's own immune system to manufacture antibodies against a microbe or a portion of that microbe. In the old days, we had killed vaccine versus live vaccine. And these you were either composed of whole components of killed organism or isolated components of the organism itself. And live or attenuated vaccines were live microbes that were weakened but rendered to be safer to administer. Toxoids refer to a bacterial toxin that's changed to a non-toxic form that then stimulates the immune system. So all of these are still in use. We still use these types of vaccines, but most of these are, in a sense, older modalities. Let's now look at immunization, and hopefully this is a review for you from other content either prior to coming into the program or early on in your clinical medicine blocks. Immunization refers to the ability to trigger or support someone's immune system to fight a specific type of pathogen. And we differentiate it between active versus passive immunity. In active immunity, we're actually stimulating the body's B cells to produce antibodies primarily, but that takes time. And so by giving vaccines or active immunity by exposure to certain pathogens, that triggers the B cells to produce antibodies over time. But that takes typically anywhere from weeks to months of time after the exposure to trigger a robust response with antibodies. Passive immunity gives patients immediate protection, but it's only short-term protection. What we're actually giving them are the antibodies. And this is done with immunoglobulins or with monoclonal antibodies for a number of conditions now that are done as well. And it provides an immediate protective effect as long as that antibody or those immunoglobulins are targeted against that pathogen. So an example here for active immunity in COVID is to give the COVID vaccine. And passive immunity would be use monoclonal antibodies against the COVID virus, which the concern there is those monoclonal antibodies that have been developed may or may not be as effective against the Delta variant. The same could be said for perhaps the vaccine as well. Is it targeted against the appropriate spike protein or something else that's targeted on the pathogen? Another example of active versus passive immunity might be for hepatitis B. We'll talk about hepatitis B. We have a vaccine that stimulates your own body immunity. But if you were to be exposed to hepatitis B, we have a hepatitis B immune globulin we're going to give that's going to offer you protection until the vaccine kicks in. A similar scenario might be rabies. There is a rabies vaccine, which we won't talk about here, but for folks who work with animals a lot, veterinary services and the like, we often do recommend that those individuals get a rabies vaccine. And if a patient is bit by some animal that's rabid, a dog or a bat or a raccoon or something, we have passive immunity with rabies immune globulin and a series of injections that offer protection there as well. The specific immune globulins, though, which would be passive immunity, would be developed or donated from, usually we classically think of from another patient or set of patients where their plasma is pooled and those immunoglobulins are isolated. The primary immunoglobulin we think of when we use it is IgG, which again is targeted against, hopefully, the pathogen in question or concern. Let's now talk about the older traditional vaccines. These are weakened microbes or killed microbes. The live but weakened vaccines, these are still in use. The big ones I think of are measles, mumps, rubella. Also, we have it for the varicella as well. These are live vaccines that are weakened but still can produce a modest type of weakened, perhaps even you'd say, infection. And in these circumstances, we're going to be careful about using these live but weakened vaccines in anyone who is immunocompromised or for a woman who is pregnant. The reason is because these live vaccines, these weakened microbes, can pose a risk, and the risk for an actual probably reduced intensity, but still infection. So we're going to pay attention to which ones are live vaccines that are still on the market, are used widely, until at least in the next maybe decade or so, there will be safer mRNA vaccine variants for some of these. But right now, we have some live vaccines still out there in use. More commonly are in the older traditional vaccines are killed microbes, that the microbe has been really inactivated and killed in such a way that patients who get them, they may mount a immune response to that vaccine, maybe get a little low-grade fever or something, but that's not because they're infected. It's because their body is responding and the B cells are responding, making antibodies, and that's part of the natural process for that. There's a couple of situations we use inactivated toxins, particularly I think of tetanus and diphtheria toxins, and those have been around for a long time. So for bacteria that produce the toxins like diphtheria or tetanus, the concern isn't so much the bacteria itself, it's the toxin the bacteria produces that's problematic. And we have inactivated toxins or toxoids that are will stimulate the body's immune system to target antibodies against those. The second generation vaccine, and I'm not sure this is a widely accepted term, but I'm going to use it and now in the age of mRNA vaccines, they come in a couple of different forms. One is subunit vaccines. These are vaccines that use a sub-portion of the bacteria virus that will trigger the immune response. So instead of giving a killed whole virus or bacteria, whatever, here instead we have a portion of it that will be enough to trigger a immune response. Probably the most common of these is the acellular pertussis vaccine. Before the acellular pertussis vaccine, the subunit of the pertussis particle or pertussis itself was available, the older pertussis vaccine had a pretty high degree of sensitivity reactions and or adverse effects. And the acellular pertussis vaccine is much better tolerated for patients, doesn't produce as significant an adverse effect profile, and yet works really well at preventing pertussis. So there are a few examples of these subunit vaccines on the market, and we'll sort of go through those as we go through the specific vaccines. Also, sort of later on in the second generation vaccines are the conjugate vaccines. These are vaccines that are developed in such a way that they will allow for a better or more robust immune response, particularly in younger children. The classic example here is Haemophilus B vaccine for children that can cause meningitis, and this has been formulated specifically for children so they can see it. And as a comment here, whenever there's a teddy bear on a slide, that will sort of suggest that this has a more pediatric focus to it when we think of pediatric immunology and pediatric immunization processes. There is a lot of mRNA vaccine information that's available to you, and this just under 5-minute video I think is a great way for you to kind of learn how the newest vaccines on the block, the mRNA, particularly the COVID vaccine, how they work and what their role is and how they compare to some of these older vaccines. So what I'd like you to do is to right now watch this presentation, and then in when you're finished with this, you can move on to the next slide. But this explains it in a better way than I could probably do it with better graphics than I could do it. So the CDC has done a good job at also encouraging uh, both patients and providers to understand how the new mRNA COVID vaccines work. And basically, they just will really target the spike protein on the COVID virus specifically using messenger RNA to have your body make messenger RNA. The vaccine itself encourages the messenger RNA to be incorporated into our cells to then produce the spike proteins as the video sort of outlined. But it doesn't contain the virus, and it doesn't change DNA. It doesn't do anything like that. In fact, in a way to sense it, if you stop and think about the argument, for example, that, gee, you're inserting messenger RNA in your cells, and is that affecting, is that an issue or a concern? Well, if you get infected by the COVID itself, they will replicate a much larger DNA or RNA into your cells than you would ever get with the COVID vaccine. So the concern is it doesn't change your DNA. It gets sort of wiped out as once it's in process, it kind of disappears over time, as the last video sort of shared with you. When you do, though, make the antibodies, your body does respond sometimes with mild symptoms, pyrogenic nature of making antibodies, and a mild fever, sometimes headaches, muscle aches, something like that. That's just indicative that your body is mounting antibody responses, not that you're infected. So the vaccine works, as the video outlined, to make copies of the spike protein so you can then produce antibodies against that spike protein. The CDC has lots of great data on COVID-19 vaccines themselves, training modules, both in general for clinicians who are giving the COVID vaccine, and then specific for each of the currently available vaccines, the Janssen or Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccines. So I encourage you to sort of, if you have the time, to sort of spend a little time sort of looking at that. The COVID-19 safety and development outline has been listed also by the CDC. I'm not going to go into depth other than that there are many, many patients who in each of these studies for mRNA vaccines, thousands and thousands of patients have been studied before the vaccines were made available for widespread use. And then they get thoroughly reviewed and scoured, and the process really is quite rigorous for safety and efficacy. In addition, once the vaccine is approved for use, and as of the beginning of September 2021, the Pfizer vaccine is fully approved by the FDA, and we're expecting the other two vaccines to be imminently FDA approved. But there is also an ongoing monitoring process, a couple of different systems that are done for any vaccine, including the COVID vaccine. The vaccine adverse event reporting system gets triggered in a couple of different ways, so that anytime there's a problem with any vaccine, that data gets scoured. Patients who have a problem are encouraged to self-report, or their healthcare provider self-report, and they try to assemble more data about it. In addition, what is sort of unique about the COVID vaccine, and some of you may have had this experience as well, is that patients who have gotten the COVID vaccine, many of them are encouraged to go to the vSafe website and register. And I know when I did this, it was really quite amazing that they would give you a daily check-in on each day after your vaccine for up to 2 weeks about how you're doing. Are you having any side effects? What kind of side effects are you having, if any? And then they periodically check, they remind you of when your second vaccine is due, if you've got a Pfizer or a Moderna vaccine. They also will monitor how your response was to the second vaccine, and they'll track whether or not you've been diagnosed with COVID. And they'll do this for up to a year afterwards. Now, they don't do it every day after the first couple of weeks. They do it every couple of weeks and then every couple of months. And I think I'm now on almost a 6-month sort of check-in with them. I periodically get a text to kind of do that. But this provides them real-time data to assure safety and efficacy of vaccines, broader, even though, in a sense, it allows all of us to participate in their research. The FDA also has a process for emergency use authorization, which they utilized with the COVID vaccines. Now that Pfizer is fully FDA approved, this is no longer an issue for that Pfizer vaccine, but it still is in place as of early September for the Moderna and the Janssen vaccines. And these are processes that that the FDA uses. And basically, there's an imminent threat by not having the vaccine available, where they might use preliminary data or data that's not fully scoured for emergency use. And so this has been sort of a concern for some clinicians. Gee, was this put on the market too soon? But we had the imminent threat of COVID sort of warranted this emergency use authorization. What that means for providers is that we just are obligated to be a little more diligent to make sure patients get appropriate fact sheets and reporting any data that is appropriate to the CDC and the FDA via the vaccine adverse event reporting system. So that's really not much different than for vaccines in general, but I think as healthcare providers, we sort of recognize that, gee, we don't have the best of full data yet. We're still working on that data, and we as providers are responsible for contributing to that data set. A couple other points that I think are helpful before we get into specific vaccines is to evaluate if the vaccine is effective, vaccine effectiveness. And there's lots of ways to do this, but I will say that one thing that a lot of people in our culture really don't have a good idea about, or don't, it's kind of fuzzy in their minds, is risk-benefit assessment. Statistics or, odds of, one thing or another. And one way that we kind of look at this is that with vaccines, there is a risk for vaccines with side effects, but there is a risk that is generally far greater for not getting vaccinated. And quantifying the risk for vaccinated versus unvaccinated patients is important to evaluate that in a systematic way. And here, the CDC gives an example, and they will in a minute in the next slide, of how they estimate vaccine efficacy. And it's calculated, not that you'd be expected to calculate this, but you look at the risk of getting a particular illness after exposure in an unvaccinated group, comparing it to a vaccinated group, and then dividing it by the risk in the unvaccinated group. So let's give an example in the next slide. Their example looked at the effectiveness of varicella vaccine, and I'm not going to get so much in the detail here, except that it compared the effectiveness of the vaccine, in vaccinated versus unvaccinated patients. So the percent of exposure, 42% rate of, or 43% rate of patients are exposed to varicella without the vaccine. 43% of those would get varicella, versus if you've been vaccinated, 11%. And divided by the 42% is, so the number really means that the difference is a 72% sort of fewer varicella cases had they not been vaccinated. So this is kind of in line and keeping with about the percentages you would expect with most of the older vaccines. Most of the older vaccines sort of hover in a range, influenza vaccine or many of the others hover in the range of somewhere from 60 to 90% efficacy. The vaccines I can think of that have higher efficacy rates, certainly the COVID-19 vaccine, uh, before the Delta variant was available, was probably in the range of about 90-95% efficacy, compared to, uh, with the Delta variant, it might have waned some with some of the vaccines. That data is still evolving, but it's still probably above 80% or so. And then even if folks get it, the severity of their illness is much reduced. Particularly, we see this with the number of patients who are vaccinated who require hospitalization or not with COVID. But this only looks at whether or not you get the condition, not about the severity of your illness, which vaccines probably also offer a benefit for. Okay, the other vaccines that have a high efficacy rate in addition to COVID-19 vaccine would be the herpes zoster or shingles vaccine is in the range of 90-95% risk reduction. We also see that other cohorts in different vaccines, they vary differently. For example, the influenza vaccine, depending on each year, the formulation, that's how it matches with the strains of influenza that are sort of in the community, may range from 60 to 80% or so in the majority of patients. So, but what's important to know is, as you're explaining this to patient, the risks for the vaccine itself, they may have some uncomfortable side effects and a sore arm, and we'll talk about side effects in a bit. But the benefit of avoiding these vaccine preventable diseases is enormous, and it's exponentially, the benefit is 1,000 times or more compared to the risk. And the risk of serious consequences, if you look at serious injury or death with the vaccine versus without the vaccine, again, we're usually in the range of 100 to 1,000 to a 10,000-fold difference between the benefits and the risks of vaccines. So really important to kind of keep that in mind as you're sharing with patients. Patients don't really or may have trouble with understanding, quantifying that risk and quantifying that benefit in their own mind. So anything we can do to help them do that is helpful. Here's a CDC initiative that works with the World Health Organization and other countries to trying to look at expanding vaccination around the world. And there's sort of a startling sort of statistic here that, as you read the top sentence or two here, that vaccines prevent about 2.5 million deaths among children under the age of 5 every year. 2.5 million lives saved in children just by vaccination. And yet, even then, a lot of people are not vaccinated. A child dies about every 20 seconds from a disease that could have been prevented by a vaccine. Pretty startling images. And so, as we think about that, the number of people who have serious adverse events and die from vaccines, is minimal. Compared to these staggering numbers of how many deaths are prevented from vaccines. So important for patients to kind of understand that concept. When adverse effects do happen, there are a lot of side effects that are seen. Most often they're local reactions. You can almost always expect for most vaccines a local mild to moderate pain in the arm, usually, sometimes redness or a little swelling. Sometimes those are pretty common. Some vaccines more so than others. And then some vaccines have some degree of systemic reactions when your body is triggering B cells to make antibodies. Those could be manifest by fever, headache, fatigue, body aches. But usually even those are relatively mild, and they can last a day or two. I think what we sort of anecdotally refer to is that some individuals, after their second COVID vaccine with either Pfizer or Moderna, sort of reported that their second vaccine sort of produced a more robust antibody response, and during that period, the day or two, they were kind of wiped out for a day or two. But compared to getting COVID, that is a very small price to pay. Okay, many other vaccines don't really cause that significant type of reaction, but sometimes do. There's also a lot of misinformation about vaccines, a lot. And one of the ones that has sort of been on for the last decade or two is whether or not vaccines contribute to autism or autism spectrum disorder. And to keep in mind that autism itself is quite common, diagnosed on the spectrum. 1 in 54 children have identified in the United States with some degree of autism developing. That's a really high baseline rate. Vaccines themselves, the rate of autism in people who are vaccinated versus not is no different. Study after study have demonstrated that. The fact that someone gets a vaccine and then is diagnosed with autism, there's not a cause effect there. It's the baseline rates of autism are independent of whether people were vaccinated or not. And so vaccines themselves don't cause autism. In addition, there was concern with an ingredient in some older vaccines, thimerosal, a preservative, that caused autism. And, that's pretty much been removed from vaccines now. But even still, that ingredient was not correlated at all with autism. So again, this misinformation that people want to latch onto, unfortunately with social media, it's kind of alarming that people will believe this stuff and yet won't believe healthcare providers or experts in the field and or look at data or evaluate scientific data. They instead will follow what's on their social media or their silo information, which is dangerous, frankly. And so really is a major stumbling block in appropriate vaccination and disease prevention. A couple other quick things here to talk about before we get into the individual vaccines. This is an interesting study that happened, almost 2 decades ago. They looked at the different rates of immunization with infants depending on both the size of the needle and the site of injection. There's a number of studies here. And the bottom line is that you want to pay attention to the specific vaccine information about the size of the needle. Are you demonstrating that the drug, if it's intended to be an IM vaccine, are you getting into the appropriate muscle? And that may affect the degree of immunization that individual gets. And so important when you look at the rates of vaccine response that you follow the recommendations for that particular vaccine on that individual, both in infants, the site of injection. For example, I can think of a similar situation with hepatitis B vaccine that was noted that when it was given in the gluteus, we had a less robust response and immunologically than if it was given in the deltoid. And that might be a function of also needle length, in that if you, instead of getting an IM tissue, in muscular tissue, you got into adipose tissue because the needle wasn't long enough or something like that, you might not get the same immune response. So important to recognize that the technique does make a difference with the efficacy and safety of vaccines. There is also a concern or a question about whether or not in the state you're practicing, if you practice in the United States, requires you to report vaccine preventable diseases or outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases to your local or state public health department. In general, that's a good thing to do anyway, so that the state can then report that to the CDC and they know, gee, there's an outbreak of pertussis in this geographic area or an outbreak of measles in this geographic area. So important to do that, but there is not a national standard for requiring reporting of vaccine preventable diseases. It's on a state-by-state basis. There are lots of ways to do that. You could just check directly with your Department of Public Health, but here is also a immunization action coalition which links up the immunization data and individual state immunization websites by state, that if you went to this website, you could find out what's going on in the state you're practicing in as far as guidelines for vaccination and what gets reported to the Department of Public Health for what vaccine preventable diseases. A last set of slides before we get into individuals I'd like to sort of go through is the sense of how many folks are vaccinated. And this is even not COVID vaccine. This is everything else pre-COVID. So here's a study that was done, published in the CDC in the Morbidity Mortality Weekly, and MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report out of the CDC is a great place to go for all kinds of public health data, both infectious disease and non-infectious disease health-related issues. Trauma, gunshot wounds, car accidents, suicide attempts, as well as infectious disease processes and the rates of those. In this study, they looked at the vaccine rates for people adults over the age of 19. And it's kind of a little busy to read, but if you look, even the most, as in 2018, even the most robust vaccination rates are hovering around 60-65%, meaning folks who are candidates for that vaccine, a good number of them still are not vaccinated. In some of those numbers, the pneumococcal vaccine in higher risk patients who are candidates for it between the age of 19 and 64, that rate's about 20%. Of folks who should be probably getting the vaccine are candidates for it and are not getting it. So this one graphic sort of indicates that we have a real problem with people not getting vaccinated, and part of our job is really one of the most important things we can do as practitioners in healthcare is to encourage vaccine, adhering to vaccine protocols and getting as many people vaccinated against these diseases as possible. There's a whole other set of slides on these same websites. I encourage you, if you're interested in going to it. But they have, similar tables for different conditions. Here's one for who got influenza vaccine. And what I want to kind of talk to is, in addition to the fact that a lot of people aren't getting influenza vaccine, there are also clear health disparities in subpopulations, cohorts that are even less likely to get vaccinated than others. And you can see here self-identified Black or Hispanic individuals are often in most vaccine sort of assessments lower than their Caucasian Northern European counterparts. And this may be a function of access to health care. It may be a function of understanding and where they are. It may be a function of their understanding of how there's been bias, history of bias in that cohort, in that population over the years, and so they're fearful of whether the data is real or not, or whether they're going to be abused because there's been a history of healthcare abuse in those sub-cohorts. So important for us to recognize that and to do everything we can to encourage all individuals, no matter where they are, but particularly identify those folks who are marginalized or somehow receiving, suboptimal care to really improve their access. Here's another study that sort of looked at the tetanus, diphtheria, and acinetobacter pertussis vaccine status in the last 10 years. And again, we see differences between folks who are self-identified as Northern European versus self-identified Black or Hispanic, or in this group, Asian populations. So I'd encourage you to look at what's going on in your particular state and region about what is reported to each local state health department and the CDC. I think that I state in this slide that every case has to be reported, but that it really depends on the state you're in. So some states that you may practice in don't require that, but it's still good practice to do it. If someone has a vaccine preventable disease, that should be reported to the local and the state health department. One of the last things I'd encourage you to do is to sort of look at any of the data and any of the arguments that people may have. There's lots of them with misinformation. And one of the concerns for vaccines was whether or not someone who was vaccinated would have a different allergy development over time versus if they weren't vaccinated. And here's an old study from 20 years ago that sort of, pretty much concluded that there's not a correlation between allergic reactions or development of atopic diseases of any type with vaccination. And yet that's still a myth that's perpetuated on some of these misinformation sites. So I think I encourage you to kind of look at where the patients are, listen to what their concerns or myths are, and try to do your best to debunk them without being overly confrontational. And the kind of concerns that patients may have with all of this misinformation on vaccines they could be pretty solid in where they are, and convincing them otherwise is difficult. But continually listening to where patients are, respecting where they are, but encouraging them to look at the data and encouraging them to get vaccinated for themselves and their children will be probably a lifelong concern in your practice. The last area that we're going to spend the rest of this is to look at what the specific CDC vaccine schedules are. They are updated every year by the CDC, usually in late December or January. And I'm also going to sort of share with you an app you can put on your phone that update any changes in vaccine status right away to your phone, so you are better able to sort of manage vaccine risk and benefit for the patient who's in front of you. So that website you go to in the CDC's website, you can just use a search engine and go for CDC immunization schedules, and you'll come to this site, or it gets updated periodically. But there's lots and lots of information here. But the main cohorts of information are the child-adolescent schedules and information about who gets what vaccine when, in what cohorts, and then adult immunization, folks who are 19 years old and older. There's also a whole set of resources with healthcare provider resources available, consumer resources available, lots of other things on this website. I encourage you to do that. In addition, important for you to, I think, have this app downloaded to your mobile device. The CDC has a vaccine app that is very easy to use. It is free, it is updated, and once you learn to navigate that, it becomes really very simple for you to then say, okay, the patient in front of me is X years old, they have these comorbid states. What vaccine should they be getting at what times and what sequence? All of that data is right in the palm of your hand. And so I encourage you to maybe even stop this right now. Go to your app store, whether you have an Apple, an iOS, or an Android device, and go and spend a couple minutes, even stop this video, go to find this CDC vaccine schedules site with this logo. You see the V with the CDC there, and this is more or less the center of this slide. Go take a moment here, stop this presentation, go do that, play around with it a bit, and then start the rest of the presentation. Okay, let's dig into some of the specific vaccines here. When you go to the CDC's website, or if you do that, I'd encourage you to, not only to download the vaccine app from the CDC, which is very helpful in practice, you'll also find that the CDC vaccine website itself has lots of updated tables and tools for providers. What they provide every year, usually this is updated at the beginning of every calendar year, and sometimes it's tweaked during the year if major changes have happened. You'll find information that includes, pediatric-specific vaccines, adult-specific vaccines, and then related topics that are pertinent, particularly something particularly in a window of time like COVID vaccines, the update for what the latest influenza vaccine is, and currently, as of autumn of 2022, monkeypox, you can find issues for monkeypox vaccine and anything else that's kind of circulating or concerning. The tables that you see here, this is an example of the pediatric table. And the nice thing about this table is once you get used to how to read it, you'll find across the top are the ages, the typical ages when it's recommended that someone in childhood or adolescence gets a specific vaccine. And as you go down the table, particularly the first column lists the different vaccines, pretty much in order of when they're sequenced by age. You'll also find that the tables will include highlighted background colors for whether or not the particular vaccine is indicated in that window of time for almost everybody or for a subpopulation or a set of individuals. And then the green area usually indicates there's a lag time between vaccines and boosters. So I encourage you to spend some time sort of looking at this and spending this. The other thing you'll find on the slides here, on our slides here, are the little teddy bear in the usually upper right-hand corner, sometimes somewhere else on the slide, that is more specific to pediatric implications. So if it has much to do with pediatrics, you'll see a little teddy bear on the slide. Okay, so I'd encourage you to be able to go to the CDC website, find where this content is, and uh, become familiar with seeing how it's sequenced and what the vaccines are, and then we'll talk specifically about those. Not everyone, every patient will have vaccines perfectly at the sequence time. And so, what the CDC also provides are recommendations specific in pediatrics to catch up vaccines. So, what's the plan if someone has missed or is delayed in getting a vaccine? And sometimes parents say, I don't want my child, my infant, to get all of these vaccines on the same day. That they get too fussy, or I'm concerned about that. Can we space them out? And these are some guidelines about how to do that and recognizing that happens. A third set of tables, and this is true for both adults and pediatrics, is a specific set of tables about indications, relative contraindications, and absolute contraindications, and then maybe some recommendations for considered use, shared decision-making use, specifics about an issue that provides some details. But what you'll find here is that typically those vaccines that are live or live attenuated vaccines probably have in general the most contraindications in red. And so we'll speak about these vaccines, about why we are more concerned about giving these vaccines or don't want to give these vaccines for one reason or another in an individual who's pregnant or in someone who's severely immunosuppressed specifically. So we'll spec a bit about that. But again, these are, here is the pediatric-based medical indication contraindication sort of chart that at one glance you can get an idea of which vaccines are problematic and which ones are not. You'll also find that similar tables for adults, and these are broken down typically by different age groups, and you'll see across the top that's true for most, but there's some recommendations that sort of cross these groups, and you'll sort of see that it's not a perfect set of 4 columns for these different ages. And then the recommendations will often be either it's indicated for that cohort or it's indicated based on comorbid states or issues that are specific to that patient, whatever their risk factors are for that particular pathogen. So encourage you again to look and become familiar with those. Finally, the other table that the CDC does provide is this table that lists, again, like we saw in pediatrics, which vaccines are contraindicated or are precaution of use or specific recommendations for some subset in that cohort that you'd be concerned about. So encourage you again to get a sense. Again, you'll see the vaccines that usually sort of jump out here are the live attenuated vaccines for which there may be some risk for individuals who are either pregnant or immunosuppressed.